about A629.
Thanks. Thank you, Amy. Well, good afternoon. I hope you are prepared for a double session with both Martina and me, but you just had coffee, so you're ready. Well, 14 for those who prefer. So the title of our presentation is Revised and Rewritten, the Greek and Latin text of GA 629 in the Pauline Epistles. So Autobonianus Graecus 298 GA 629 is an intriguing bilingual Latin-Greek manuscript containing Acts, the Catholic Epistles, and the Pauline Epistles. The codex was likely produced in a monastery in southern Italy during the 14th century. And from its earliest appearance in academic literature in the 1800s, GA 629 attracted the attention of New Testament textual scholars because of its Latinized Greek text and its readings at important variation units like the Comma Johanneum and 1 John. While older scholarship noted these instances, they rarely included their observations with detailed textual analysis. In recent decades, Tommy Wasserman and Klaus Bachtel have interacted with GA 629 in Jude and the other Catholic epistles, making key observations about its text in specific variation units. And we've been pleased to find that there seems to be an uptick in interest in GA 629, and it was mentioned in Peter Montoro's paper earlier today. So I first encountered the manuscript working on the One Core project here at KU Leuven, which is working toward the ECM of 1 Corinthians. Its unique readings and corrections led me to investigate the manuscript in greater detail, and resulting in a paper which should be published in TC Journal later this year. For Martina, she began investigating the prologues and paratext to GA 629 in the context of the TINT project at the University of Glasgow, and her interest in it now fits with her position on the BICOS project at KU Leuven, working on or investigating the Latin and Greek bilingual manuscripts. So our collaboration in this research draws on both angles, interest in manuscripts and the textual history of the Greek Testament, as well as the development of bilingual manuscripts and their influence on the transmission of both languages. We're pleased, therefore, to acknowledge both the One Core project, sponsored by the Research Foundation Flanders, and the European Research Council, who have promoted our collaboration. So here in the beginning of the paper, I want to give an concise overview of the manuscript, highlighting a few aspects of its codicology and my reconstruction of how it was produced, because the codex's production sheds considerable light on its textual peculiarities. GA 629 was intended as a bilingual document from its inception. Scribes first copied the Latin text, leaving corresponding space for the Greek text. Notably, the Latin was placed in the left column, a reversal of the usual practice in bilingual manuscripts, where the more familiar language typically occupied the right. This decision might reflect its production within a community which did not have access to other bilingual manuscripts or did not regularly make them, and that this copy was made for their own scholarly purposes. The Latin column maintains a fixed width, consistent writing density, and features more elaborate rubrication compared to its Greek counterpart. And either at the time of initial copying the Latin column also has several corrections, which are usually placed in the margin of the manuscript or at the beginning of end of lines. And these were added after the initial copying of the text, but before the Greek was written, because in most cases, the Greek text corresponds with the correct text. Furthermore, the presence of Latin titles and prologues without Greek translation highlights the manuscript's primary function as a Latin Bible codex enhanced by the presence of Greek rather than the reverse. The subsequent copying of the Greek text by another scribe was characterized by remarkable precision and alignment to the Latin column. This meticulous matching extended to word splits across lines where the Greek equivalent of a Latin word was divided in both languages across the line breaks. The rubrication of initials is also coordinated across the two languages, and intriguingly, in several places, the Greek text contains intentional gaps which correspond to longer readings of Latin, which the scribe did not translate into Greek. At the same time, one of the examples I'll bring up today is a case where the scribe of GA 629 translated a longer Latin reading, and so this is just an interesting added in the manuscript. The manuscript also features a chart on the final folio of the manuscript, listing Greek abbreviations and their meanings which conveys that the initial users needed help to actually read the Greek text. So these details vividly illustrate the secondary status of the Greek and the scribes' rigorous engagement with the Latin text. So our paper advances the conversation about GA629 by examining how the Greek scribe revised and rewrote the text of their exemplar and how the Latin text of GA629 fits into the transmission of the Latin New Testament. We present detailed case studies from the Pauline Epistles illustrating the varied and sophisticated ways that the Greek text was adapted under Latin influence and, for the first time, observing that the Latin text was copied by multiple scribes. Moreover, we will show that the Greek scribe's intervention was not limited to a revision of the Greek text alone, but occasionally extended into the Latin column itself. So let's begin with case studies. Our case studies come from the Pauline letters, and they highlight the cross-language interaction in GA629. Martina and I will each present a few case studies, and we chose these examples to show patterns that appear throughout the manuscript, a few rare occurrences that are interesting and are isolated phenomena, and then peculiar cases where we're still trying to interpret the evidence ourselves. So let's begin. 1 Corinthians 9:9. In this example, I want to highlight the extent to which the Greek text was modified to align to the Latin column. And in English, this verse reads, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned?" And in this verse, GA629 presents a singular reading with several changes to the word order. Whereas the standard Greek text reads engar to moseos namo gegraptai, GA629 transposes gegraptai to the beginning of the sentence or the beginning of the verse, producing the singular reading gegraptai gar. This transposition, it's not a singular reading, but it is later. So it gives you the reading gegraptai gar, and this transposition is shared by only 3 other manuscripts: the ancient bilingual codices Claromontanus GA06, Fornarianus GA012, and Audiensis 010, and those will come up again, so remember them all. Each of these documents was similarly influenced by the order of the Latin text, which begins scriptum est. This original scribe of GA629 also included a word or phrase between gegraptai and tonamo, which has been erased, making it impossible to determine precisely what was written. The corrector supplied the words gar n, creating the reading gegraptai gar n, which closely reflects the Latin column scriptum est enim. I know that ink in this image is difficult to read, but that's as close as we can zoom in. The correction appears to be relatively early, though, as it does not match the handwriting of the later 16th century corrections that occur in the Greek column. And it's also worth noting that most of those later corrections moved the text into conformity with the Byzantine text, so they were de-Latinizing the text in many places. So it would be unusual for that corrector to have restored a Latinized reading. And again, the 3 bilinguals, 06, 010, and 012 are the only other manuscripts which have moved gegraptai, so you have gegraptai gar. The last change in word order occurs in the prepositional phrase ento namo moseos namo, or ento moseos namo. And GA629 reads ento namo moseos, switching the position of the last 2 words. This change has no parallel in the ancient bilinguals because these 3 ancient manuscripts, along with Codex Sangeromensis, which is a direct copy of Claromontanus, omit the prepositional phrase completely in both Latin and in Greek. So the reading in GA629 conforms to the order in the Latin text in lege mosi. The remainder of the verse has no changes in word order. The only difference from the NA28 are the readings phimoses, with the majority of manuscripts against chemoses in the editorial text. There are only a few witnesses which read the more technical term phimoses, which notably includes the other bilingual manuscripts. And this conveys that the exemplar for GA629 was a majority text manuscript rather than one that had already been Latinized, like the bilingual manuscripts. So these changes were in word order, were the independent creation of this particular scribe. Thus, in 1 Corinthians 9:9, GA629 exhibits the scribe's tendency to adapt the Greek text so that it better aligns with the Latin. These changes produced a singular reading and inadvertently rendered a sentence structure which partially aligns with the text of older bilingual manuscripts. Case number 2, 2 Thessalonians 2:4-6, and this case ultimately highlights the Greek scribe's intervention in the Latin column. This example comes from a puzzling sequence of codicological and textual discontinuities that go from folios 220 verso to 223 recto. I'll summarize the main facts, though for the sake of time, I can't lay out all the evidence. The puzzle has more pieces than today's talk can accommodate, and I plan to put it all together on another occasion. So folio 220 verso ends mid-word in 1 Thessalonians 5:10 at vigilemus, and that spans the 2 page breaks. The following 2 folios, 221 and 222, were copied by a second Latin scribe whom we've identified for the first time and covers 1 Thessalonians 5:10 to 2 Thessalonians 5:24, including a prologue between the 2 letters. This change in hand coincides with a codicological discontinuity. Whereas GA629 is typically composed of 8-leaf quires, these 2 folios form a short 2-leaf quire. And on this point, I'm indebted to Tilke Nellis, our colleague in Leuven, for sharing her notes on the quire structure based on her examination of the manuscript during a winter school on paleography at the Vatican Library. Despite the change in scribes, the order of production remained the same though. The Latin text was still copied before the Greek. The final page of the short quire, 220 verso, is unusually brief, with only 24 lines rather than the typical 28. Immediately following this is a significant correction in the Latin column on folio 223 recto, covering the verses, for this case, 2 Thessalonians 2:4-6, where 19 lines of whatever the underlying text was were thoroughly erased and replaced with a Vulgate reading. After the correction, there's a blank gap of several lines before the main text resumes written by scribe A. So this raises several questions. Was the text of folios 221 to 222 a replacement or an insertion? Why are the texts of folios 222 and 223 before the correction so badly linked? Why was there such a large portion of text erased, and by whom? And who wrote the replacement? And today I'm only going to focus on the last of those questions. Who wrote the replacement? I referred to 2 scribes, the scribe A, who is the manuscript's primary Latin copyist, and scribe B, who completed the manuscript and made many of the marginal corrections, in addition to the folios here. So while scribe B plausibly could have written the corrected text on 223 recto, the evidence suggests a 3rd scribe was responsible. Though the replacement writings resembles scribe B's, there's notable differences. The hand is coarser, with wider spacing between words and greater distance between lines. Scribe A and B followed the ruling lines carefully, whereas the scribe didn't. I acknowledge that if the correction was done by scribe B, the paleographical variation might reflect the practice of writing on a scrubbed surface rather than, which would obscure their typical copying habits. But the difference in scribal habits remains difficult to reconcile. So the replacement text includes several errors which are corrected in scribendo, a habit not typical of the other Latin scribes. Words were deleted using strike-through rather than by a dotted circle, which appears elsewhere. And perhaps most strikingly, nomina sacra are not used, a clear departure from the habits of both scribes A and B. These features suggest a 3rd hand, and I'm inclined to identify this as the scribe of the Greek column who erased something in the Latin column for a reason we can't detect yet, and then rewrote the Latin text before matching the Greek text to it. Excuse me. So the Greek text, by contrast, shows no discontinuity apart from a wider line distance than usual, which is there to match the Latin equivalent. It was copied by the same scribe who wrote the rest of the manuscript and continued the line word by word with its counterpart. The Latin correction, therefore, must have been made before or during the copying of the Greek text. This points strongly to the scribe of the Greek text as the one who erased and corrected the Latin. In addition to the style and alignment, the absence of nomina sacra and other abbreviations suggest a scribe less familiar with writing in Latin. This could correlate with the Latin correction having a wider distance of lines and a larger script, as a novice could need more room to write the text than an experienced copyist. And these features further support my hypothesis about which scribe wrote the Greek column here. Excuse me. The example highlights an often overlooked aspect of GA629. The Greek scribe was not simply following a Latin guide, but actively managed both columns. They were capable not only of adapting the Greek to the Latin, but also of intervening directly in the Latin when needed. This kind of cross-column interaction deepens our picture of how bilingual scribes operate and deserves further attention. Case 3. So this is my last case study before we turn to Martina. So in 1 Corinthians 10:17, we have an instance of direct translation of Greek into Latin. The verse in English reads, because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. In this case, both the NA28 and the majority text have the same text, to henos artu metakamen. GA629, however, has a longer form which adds and one cup to the phrase, to henos artu kai henos poteriou metakamen. Nearly every extant Greek manuscript of this verse has the standard reading. The only exceptions are the other bilingual manuscripts, GA06, 010, and 012, which all have versions of the longer reading. Here's the readings in all four manuscripts. All four manuscripts add the phrase about the cup, but construct the sentence in Greek in three separate ways. 06 reads to poteriou, 010 and 012 add the adjective henos to form to henos poteriou, and 629 omits the article completely with henos poteriou. The shared reading in 010 and 012 could be explained by a direct relationship as published in Alec Fisher's article, which has been referenced earlier today. And the expanded form of this Eucharistic formula reflects a Latin tradition primarily attested in the Vedas Latina and sporadically in manuscripts of the Vulgate. The presence of the variation only in bilingual manuscripts and its absence from purely Greek witnesses, along with each bilingual manuscript rendering the Greek in different forms, suggests that each instance of the phrase about the cup originated as a direct translation of the Latin text of that manuscript. In GA629, the Latin column reads uno pane et uno calice participamur. The Greek text, kai henos poteriou, corresponds directly to the Latin and results in a different syntactic structure than that of the other bilingual manuscripts. This rendering also omits the definite article in contrast to the other bilingual witnesses, an omission characteristic of a direct translation by a native Latin reader, since the idiomatic Greek has no corresponding term in Latin. This singular reading did not originate from a Greek manuscript tradition, but arose as a direct intervention of the Greek by the scribe who translated the phrase from the Latin column. It provides an example of bilingual scribe rewriting, or rather writing anew, its Greek text in response to the Latin text of the same manuscript. And now I'll turn to Martina.
Thank you, Andy. So the case study I've selected are drawn from the second letter to the Corinthians, which is the New Testament book I decided to focus on. And the first example is 2 Corinthians 13:10, which read, "But we pray to God that you may not do anything wrong, not that we may appear to have met the test, but you may do what is right, through we may seem to have failed." So in GA 6-9, we read tonzonta, so the living God, referring to God, which doesn't appear as a variant in the critical editions. And this Greek reading is influenced by the Latin Deum Vivum. What makes the Latin reading here particularly interesting is that it doesn't align with the Vulgate. Indeed, the Vulgate text of 2 Corinthians 13:10 reads only Deum. We observe that the Latin text found in manuscript 6-9 reads the longer reading Deum Vivum. So the Greek scribe, after reading the Latin text, chose to expand the Greek so that the phrase Deum Vivum matched and create the Greek reading tonzonta. It's also worth noting that the critical editions of the Vulgate, so the Oxford, the Stuttgart, shows no variant for Deum Vivum, and nor it is found in the Vetus Latinus manuscript, as far as I know. Nevertheless, the addition of the adjective vivum, referring to God, could be easily explained as it occurs in two other places within the letter, in 3:3 and 6:16. Here, the singular reading in the Greek text of 6-9 is due again to Latinization, as we expect in this manuscript. More importantly, it emphasizes diversity in the Latin tradition, which has not been presented in scholarship and critical editions. My second example is from 2 Corinthians 1:6-7. So another interesting aspect of this manuscript is the layers of corrections, as Andy already argued in his article. Many of these are related to the Latin text. As Andy already explained, we think that there are at least two scribes working on the manuscript. The second one, scribe B, most probably responsible for the correction. But is he responsible for all the corrections? Can we also say something about the exemplars by looking at this kind of correction? So let's concentrate on these two verses. So this passage presents several interesting variations. And I would like to start by showing you the Latin text of GA 6-9. So in this table, there is the text of the Vulgate 6-9 and then the translation. So GA 6-9 present a longer reading in the first part of the verse. Sive autem tribulamur, provesta exhortatione et salute, sive consolamur, provesta consolazione et salute, sive exhortamur, provesta exhortazione et salute, whereas the Vulgate reads sive autem tribulamur, provesta exhortazione et salute, sive exhortamur, provesta exhortazione. Among the old Latin manuscripts, it appears that no other manuscript preserves the same reading. So the old Latin tradition is divided as follows. So starting on the left, we have the manuscript that preserve the shorter reading as seen in the Vulgate, for example, VL7, 62, 65, and so on. Manuscript that retain the same long reading as GA6 to 9, though not perfectly aligned, which are 51, 58, and 88. And finally, manuscript with part of the verse moved below to verse 7, 61, 75, etc. In this manuscript, the phrase sive exhortamur provest exhortazione is moved on verse 7. So the closest readings to 6 to 9 are present in manuscript 51, 58, and 88. However, there's no still correspondence between any of these Latin manuscripts. Moreover, in 6 to 9, there is a correction of the phrase et salute, which, however, appears in all the other Latin manuscripts. So this is the folio of the manuscript with the salute being expunged through a series of dots. But what happens in the Greek column? We need to keep in mind that the Latin text was written before the Greek. So the Greek scribe followed the Latin text closely, but there's a difference. The Greek reading does not include the phrase et salute, which has been expunged in the Latin column. So let's work through the text. So we have already established that the Latin text of GA6 to 9 presents a longer reading with respect to the Vulgate. The Greek scribe did not insert the Latin phrase et salute, which is present in the Nestle Aland and omitted in a few manuscripts. And then it translated the text sive consolamur provesta consolazione et salute. While the Latin text uses consolamur, the Greek retains the same word used for exhortazione, so parakleseos, and its derivative verbs, which in this letter corresponds to both the Latin terms. Of the 19 occurrences of the Greek term in 2 Corinthians, noun and verb, 11 are translated as consolatio, 7 as exhortatio, and only 1 as solatio. The Greek tradition presents some variants, with certain manuscripts omitting the phrase uperte sumon parakleseos, later incorporating in verse 7, which is most probably the origin of the omission that we already observed in the Latin tradition. What is new in this manuscript is that the Latin addition is translated into Greek by the scribe, resulting in a new Greek reading not otherwise attested in the tradition. In a paper presented at SBL 2024, Daniel Wallace and Sean McGuire discussed the notion of lithographies in different New Testament manuscripts. And I take this occasion to thank them for having distributed the handout at the presentation. So they gave the definition of lithography as, and I quote from their handout, the repetition of what was initially written, encompassing anything from a single letter to several lines and perhaps even a whole book, unquote. They discusses the case of GA6 to 9, where the use of lithographies presented in this manuscript is an additional evidence of the priority of the Latin over the Greek. However, they note that the case of 167 is an exception because it's not marked for deletion by the scribe, as it happens in other occasions. Indeed, where the lithography is, there is no scribal intervention, and the scribe translated the Greek text according to the Latin, creating a new Greek reading. In other instances, as you can see from the slide, the Latin scribe canceled the lithography again with a series of dots and left a blank space in the Greek column, such as here in Romans 7:1 folio 121 verso. So the Greek scribe realized it's a repetition, and so it doesn't have the Greek text. Nonetheless, a closer examination of this example reveals that in these verses there is no lithography. The Latin text does not feature a repetition, as it uses different verbs, consolamur and exhortamur. The Greek scribe, in contrast, translated the verb consolamur with the same word used for the Latin word exhortazione, inadvertently creating the repetition. This suggests that, contrary to Wallace and McGuire's argument, this is not an exception, as it's not a case of lithography. The Latin text, which was written first, does not exhibit any repetition. Instead, it's the Greek scribe choice to render different Latin verbs in the same way that creates the repetition. And this explains why the scribe doesn't mark the repetition, as it happens in other examples. So this case study underscored the importance of examining both language in bilingual manuscripts, as focusing only on one may result in overlooking crucial information. So according to Wallace and McGuire, the lithography demonstrates that the Latin column was likely produced first. However, the lack of knowledge about the exemplar makes it difficult to determine precisely where the lithography begins and ends. So the elements relevant for this case are the follows. Both the Latin and Greek traditions attest the omission of et salute, or soteria in Greek. This omission does not suggest a correction toward the Vulgate text, as the Vulgate includes the phrase and does not contain the sentence sive consulamo, provesta consolazione, which, however, appears in some Old Latin manuscripts. So why did the scribe erase it? Was he following an exemplar different from the Vulgate? Did he copy an extra et salute by mistake? The cases of deletion are particularly relevant to this discussion. While most appear to be dictography, as examined by Wallace and McGuire, the erased text in passages such as 2 Corinthians 1:6-7 is especially noteworthy. In this instance, the scribe seems to have corrected the Latin text not against the Vulgate, as in the case of other examples, but against a different source. On the other hand, in other passages where the scribe removed extra material to align the manuscript with the Vulgate, the Latin text reflects all Latin readings. So this raises an important question. Did the scribe make all the correction, or it's also possible that the Greek scribe also contributed to them? We now turn to a new section where each of us will address larger issues in the textual history of Greek and Latin as they relate to GA 629. Andy is going to present on the relationship between 629 and other bilinguals, where I will concentrate on the Latin text of 2 Corinthians in this manuscript.
Thank you, Martina. So now we turn to a new section, or sorry, that's what Martina just told you. Well, and she said it better than I would. So bilingual manuscripts. First, I will explore the relationship between GA 629 and other ancient bilingual manuscripts of Paul's letters. Several of the case studies highlighted similar readings in GA 629 and the codices Claromontanus, Flanerianus, and Augiensis, which are often identified as witnesses to the so-called Western text in the Pauline letters, which we've heard a bit about today. These connections exist despite my earlier research on GA 629 demonstrating that its Greek text was copied from a standard Byzantine manuscript. The apparent affinity between 629 and these ancient bilinguals raises significant questions about how cross-language interaction may have shaped elements of the Western text tradition. The Nestle-Aland apparatus underscores the connection between 629 and these ancient manuscripts. 629 has been cited 267 times in the Nestle-Aland edition, almost exclusively in the Pauline letters in Hebrews. Only one of these is in Acts. In 49 variation units, 06, 010, 012, and 629 have a reading attested by fewer than 5 other witnesses, making them highly distinctive within the manuscript tradition. Among these, 20 of the 49 are group readings unique to these set of 4 bilingual manuscripts, and 5 more are shared with only one other manuscript. So these additional witnesses represent coincidental alignments. Sorry, I lost my place. So these represent coincidental alignments rather than substantive textual relationships found in the bilingual tradition itself. And while GA 629 was copied from a Byzantine exemplar, its Greek text frequently aligns with these distinctive bilingual readings, not because it preserves an ancient textual stream, but because its scribes systematically modified the Greek text to conform to the Latin column. These renderings are coincidental rather than stemming from their exemplar. A striking example occurs in Galatians 2:9, where GA 629's reading mirrors that of 06, 012, and 010, despite its Byzantine exemplar almost certainly reading the standard Greek Jakobos kai kephas. Instead, GA 629, like the ancient bilinguals, reads Petros kai Jakobos, a rare reading found only in these 3 bilingual manuscripts. This change is a result of Latin influence, as GA 629's Latin text deviates from the standard Vulgate reading, Jacobus et Cephas, and instead aligns with the Vetus Latina tradition, which is split between Cephas and Peter. This demonstrates that the scribe, in aligning the Greek text with the Latin, inadvertently recreated a reading found in ancient bilingual witnesses. More broadly, GA 629 exhibits occasional agreements with other early manuscripts, such as Codex Vaticanus and P46, which are listed in the apparatus on the slide. And it's interesting that P46 is the only other manuscript which has Petros instead of Kephas. These cases demonstrate that GA 629 does not transmit an independent textual tradition, but rather a restructured Byzantine text modified under Latin influence. The implications of this phenomenon extend beyond the internal dynamics of GA629 itself. The independent creation of Western readings through Latinization provides a potential model for understanding aspects of the Western text development. If a 14th century scribe could, through bilingual alignment, produce readings that closely resemble those of ancient bilingual manuscripts, it raises the possibility that similar cross-language textual dynamics contributed to the emergence of Western text tradition. However, this remains an open question. The ancient bilinguals still contain numerous distinctive readings which do not appear in GA629, highlighting the need for further research into the origins and transmission of the so-called Western text in the Pauline Epistles. Nevertheless, GA629 provides a valuable case study in how the scribe of bilingual manuscripts could shape textual traditions through revision and rewriting, offering insight into the stream of textual transmission. Now to Martina.
Thank you. So in the last part of the presentation, I would like to discuss the Latin text of 2 Corinthians in GA629. So from my transcription of the text and the collation I made with the other Old Latin manuscripts, taking into account the work of the principal Pauline Epistles, which already mentioned today, and the manuscript images were available, it appears that the Latin text of 629 present a variety of unique readings and readings that align with other Old Latin manuscripts. Indeed, the text of 629 is divergent from the text of the Vulgate in 164 places. Among these, 104 readings align with other Latin manuscripts, while 60 readings are not found in other Latin traditions. And I classify the readings into categories. So we have word order, for example, the change of order of words, as in 2 Corinthians 1:4, exhortamur et ipse Deo and et ipse exhortamur Deo. Personal pronouns and conjunction, which involve the addition, omission, or variation of these particles, as 73 exemplify, 629 ad vestram, and then transform the nostris in vestris. Prayer elements, which pertain to the inclusion of words related to Deus, Christus, and similar terms, as 11.3. So the Vulgate as in Christo, and 629 as in Christo Jesu Domino Nostro, and cases and verbs, which address variation in case declension or verb conjugation. The other category encompasses elements that do not fit in the other categories, for example, 10:16, with the addition of loca, in illa loca que, and then 11:21, with the addition of in ac parte. So this table shows all the readings of 629 that differs from the text of the Vulgate. They are subdivided in the categories I mentioned above. And I start with the Vetus Latina manuscript. The majority of readings aligns with the following manuscripts. We have 58, so Codex Benigerodensis, with 47 readings, and then we have 3 with 40 readings, 61, Book of Arma, BL 88, and I quote here from Professor Patton, part of a Latin Bible copied in the 9th or 10th century in Western Germany. The text is Vulgate throughout, apart from a folio 21, quoting 2 Corinthians 7:3 to 10:18, which has an old Latin affiliation. And in 629, the reading is different from the Vulgate and agrees with this codex as scattered through the entire letter. BL 89 and with all with 40 readings each. And then finally, we have 51 with 39 readings, Codex Gigas. Interestingly, each of the manuscripts that contains the majority of readings present one of the most readings in at least one of the categories. 61 has the most change in personal pronouns, 58 in verbs and other, 89 in conjunctions and prayer. Moreover, all these manuscripts present none of only a few case studies of different word order. As far as the commentary tradition is concerned, and here I'm taking the sigla in the work of the principal Pauline Epistles, GA629 also aligned with the commentary tradition of Ambrosiaster, which is divided here in the sigla, and that's also in the lemmata of the Pauline commentary of Pelagius. So, of course, my examination has only focused on the second letter to the Corinthians, so we cannot speculate further about the possible sources of the Latin text of GA629. A full collation of all the Latin Pauline letters would provide clearer understanding of the type of Latin text present in manuscript. And this could also present an opportunity to identify all the readings that differ from the Vulgate, and in the future, explore whether there is a common textual stream. So in conclusion, By analyzing these cross-language interactions, we show that GA629 embodied an active, dynamic interplay between Latin and Greek scribal traditions. By reckoning with the both Greek and Latin texts simultaneously, we provide a more comprehensive picture of how GA629 functions as a bilingual manuscript, taking account of it as a site of Greek textual vision and a witness to Latin textual transmission. The study thus advances our understanding of the cross-language scribal practices, the textual history of the New Testament, and the complexities of bilingual manuscript culture. Our case studies highlighted patterns in the text of the manuscript, as well as rare occurrences, which make this document so intriguing. And these cases also point to avenues for further research. First of all, the Greek scribe of GA629 was hardly a passive copyist. He actively revised and rewrote the text of his exemplar to make the text correspond to the Latin text of the manuscript. This process of Latinization introduced new and rare readings that do not appear in Greek tradition. Secondly, the Latin text was copied by two primary scribes working at approximately the same time. Scribe A worked first and copied the majority of text. Scribe B completed the manuscript and made most of the Latin correction. In addition, as Andy proposes, the Greek scribe made their own correction to the Latin text one time. These had never been discussed in early publications and need to be studied in detail. The layers of corrections and also underscore that GA629 was probably copying following a mixture of Vulgate and all Latin tradition, making the identification of the exemplars more challenging. Thirdly, many of the Latinized Greek readings correspond to readings in the prominent bilingual manuscripts of the Pauline letters, which are affiliated with the so-called Western text. This connection offers another angle for reflecting on the origins or development of the Western tradition in antiquity, because the same process of rendering the Latin New Testament in Greek may have contributed to the origin. And finally, fourthly, the Latin text of manuscript 6 to 9 contain unique readings, as well as readings related to the Old Latin tradition. Further study of the Latin text of other Pauline letters could help us trace the stream of the Latin text and provide a clearer understanding of the unique reading in this manuscript. So as we hope to have demonstrated in this presentation, there is still much to explore regarding this fascinating manuscript. And if you already work on it, or if you're interested in deepening your knowledge of this New Testament manuscript, or if we have inspired you with new questions, this is your lucky day. We, together with Professor Kraniker and I, are organizing a conference on GA6 to 9, which will take place in Leuven from June 10 to 12, 2026. The conference will bring scholars in the New Testament textual criticism and manuscript study to discuss several topics, including the history of the manuscript and its production, the textual character of the Latin and Greek text, GA6 to 9 in the context of multilingual manuscripts. Furthermore, we are interested in GA6 to 9's place in New Testament textual history and questions concerning the so-called Western text, computational analysis of GA6 to 9, and partext and scribal interventions. So we will have invited speakers, and also we will open a call for paper soon. So if you would like to learn more about this manuscript, mark your calendar now and join us in Leuven next year. And of course, if you have any questions, just write to us. And on behalf of Andy, thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, we've got a good 10 minutes for questions. If anyone would like to kick off. Yeah, Tommy?
Yeah, I was just curious about those erased lines and so on. And the first thought also, it's not like protocologically different choirs and stuff. Can it be something replaced and trying to fit in so we don't end blank here? Or
Yeah, I think that one possibility is that the original reading, the preceding page to the correction is shorter, and then the text of the correction could have been rewritten of virtually the same text, so that it's stretched and leaving less blank space. I think that is a plausible explanation for the evidence. It is still as tricky, though, how the texts link from the beginning of the. It's just not very neat because there was so much originally written there to link back to the original part, which makes me question whether something else is happening here.
Photography.
It's possible.
Photography, which was then erased.
Yeah, you have the repetition of the word quad several times in this place, in this string of verses, which could give an opportunity for photography. But the amount of space needed, given scribes' normal copying practices and the number of characters per line, would make that, you would need multiple problems to be getting that situation.
Yeah, go on, Michael.
Can part of the undertext that was erased still be read, or is everything away?
At the moment, no. So there's traces of the bottom line of the correction at the, so you have the bottom of a few characters, and then the rest is very thoroughly erased. I wonder if the Vatican let us use an ultraviolet lamp if we were there, if anything could come out, but that's, you can't know. And then multispectral imaging is difficult to do for a single page. So at the moment, this is the best I can do with that question, but I would like to, that would be a dream scenario for me. So, yeah. Yeah. Do anything. Yeah.
We're even not allowed to talk to each other.
Yeah.
In the reading room.
Can I just ask about the excision marks in the Latin where you have the dots around words? And you were saying you think the Greek scribe intervened. Is that correct in some of those cases?
I mean, it's only an hypothesis because I don't see, I mean, if the Latin scribe corrected it based on what? Not on the Vulgate, or he has all Latin manuscripts, or?
My question was about the ink. I mean, the Greek ink, and I don't know if it's the lighting, it just seems on the images lighter. The dots
It is.
The dots
but
around the words seem closer in color, but I don't know how you analyze dots really.
No, it is. That's why I think that maybe the Greek scribe realized that that was not part of the text, whatever the exemplar was, and so decided to delete it, and that's why also it's not in Greek.
But are the dots around the Latin word, do you think the Greek scribe put the dots around the Latin word? And
I don't know. It just
to
to make
Latin
sense.
scribe's pen to do it? I'm just not sure. It's a genuine question.
Yeah, I don't know either. But you know, for ink, maybe if we have the occasion to see the manuscript in person, you can, yeah, of course you can say more. But yeah,
Really
thanks.
Since the Greek column seems to be sort of a 14th century one-off, do you think 629 should be included in the museum?
I think that is a question that is raised by the research. Insofar as the ECM's objective is to represent textual history in the first millennium and beyond, I think that it's worth keeping it in because it does chart a particular moment in textual history, even though it's been included in the ECM of the other parts of the New Testament and has also been selected for the Pauline letters. So in one sense, not using it in Paul would not be as nice because it's already available elsewhere. So this gives us the comprehensive picture. But I think that we can think about where it fits in textual history and how to weigh the evidence that it provides in better clarity because of the research we're doing. And so leaving it in charts textual history and moves us one step closer to the Editio Critica Maxima.
Next generation. Next generation.
Well, actually, this is an online question from Dirk, who says GA629 is, of course, well known, the earliest Greek version of the Comma Ioanneum in 1 John 5:7, about 3 heavenly witnesses, where the Greek might be a back translation. As you demonstrated, this happened to the Pauline corpus. Can you shed any light on that particular variant in your experience so far?
I haven't looked into that particular variant myself in detail yet, but it is an accurate summary of the research that is one of the things that was exciting about this, because it is the oldest manuscript where the Trinitarian formula is in the main text. And you can explain the text there by the Latin presence and order. So that's where it gets tricky. I think if it was translated and then you have the Trinitarian or the liturgical Eucharistic formula translated in 1 Corinthians, and the manuscript we can say confidently was produced in a monastery, I wonder if there was some sort of liturgical or sensitivity to the things that were directly translated, whereas other instances, like one example Martina has found in Hebrews, you have a longer reading in the Latin text, which is a longer version of a Psalm citation, which they didn't directly translate into Greek. So maybe that would help lend an explanation to, maybe there's a logic to what got translated, but I think it would be worth revisiting the 19th century scholarship to see if it was directly translated or not.
I mean, I can actually add to that from a
Oh, great.
certain textual commentary, but with my hat on rather than Dirk's. But the distinctive feature, if I recall, of 629 in the Johannine comma is that the Greek has no definite articles, and that
which matches
makes it look very strongly as it's come from the Latin, and at that point, it's not an idiomatic translation.
Thank you.
Anyone else? No? Oh, go on and run.
You have an extra landscape with lights. So, like how it's, it seems like we are not in anything in Greek.
No, there are only in Latins, which are the marginate prologues, but they have a text which is not, which does not completely align with the text, for example, provided in the Bruce edition. There are variants that are not recorded there, which I know the Bruce didn't take into account all the tradition, but it would be worth exploring where they come from. And I think this would be another way to understand, the production, because they say, it could be Southern Italian, but in which kind of context, in a liturgical context, and we can say more also by analyzing this. And I think the fact that we're not translated in Greek maybe was because they just was not useful, because the manuscript was mainly productive for a Latin-speaking community.
So did you find some biographical elements, perhaps more in the Greek text that can ensure that this manuscript was produced or actually within a Southern Italian community? Because I think there are, so if it was within that Southern Italian community, there are certain specific aspects in the bibliography from the provincial areas of the Southern Italy. So I mean,
so that was studied by Giuseppe De Gregorio, and he was saying that both the Greek and the Latin script match Southern Italian script, even though it was just proposing that because, like, you cannot locate a manuscript based only on the script. So that was his hypothesis. And he was also considering this in a bilingual context with other manuscripts. So that's why he proposed Southern Italy as an hypothesis.
Okay, I think we're probably about done then. So if we could all thank Martina.